Okay, welcome back from break. Let me just check in. Do we have any other questions? Okay,
We do.
okay.
Is it privacy if they are posting where they are, if their profile is public?
Okay, say that again.
So you were talking about
Yeah, privacy.
privacy and being at Wendy's. So it's saying if their profile is
Yeah.
public, is it still a privacy violation to research it?
I think so the question is, if they publicize where they are and it's a public posting, is it a violation of privacy to look them up? I don't know that it's legally a violation of anything. I think it's just something to be aware of and perhaps to address openly with our client that, I guess people know this. I just think it's something to be sensitive about. And I'm kind of running through in my head now where all the implications are. But when you make your profile public, I guess you need to accept that it's public. I guess what maybe the spirit of this is for us to resist getting or searching out information about our clients that they're not self-reporting to us. That's probably the spirit of it. The question that was brought to me was more, if I friended a person on social media and they were my client, then that becomes this borderline or dual relationship. Or if I have a professional profile and people join it, does that, without intention perhaps, but indicate that we have a professional relationship? So I have to say this stuff is very complex. Now, periodically, I go online and research the newest kind of ethical dilemmas because our world is changing so rapidly. And so if you work for an organization, hopefully they have a social media policy that you can use and go by, or just kind of talk among yourselves too with if-then scenarios. I'm just very conservative about what I post. And certainly when I had a more public role, I was conservative for a different reason. Now I'm conservative in part because even in my private practice arena, I know that people look me up. And I don't like a lot of complications in my life, and I like my professional life to be separate. So I'm pretty conservative. I will tell you some things I was very careful of when I worked, particularly with a population of people on community release from prison. And when I worked in a largely criminal justice population, I am very careful about anything about my family or my kids being out there. I, for instance, didn't allow my kids' pictures to be online at their school as part of school marketing. I just was concerned that there would be a possibility that someone could use my kids to get back at me or presume a kind of relationship with me that we did not have. I've always been fairly conservative about that. And that is different than the movement we have currently, which is oriented towards peers. I guess I would urge you, even if you function largely as a peer in the behavioral health arena, that you are conscious about your role as a peer. Means there's a natural level of self-disclosure because of the nature of your position and the nature of your work. That's different than full self-disclosure about your whole life. Once it's out there, it's out there. And once something happens, it happens. So when I work with new counselors or new peer supporters, I do kind of urge some caution about that. majority of people we interact with are really good people who have had traumatic lives, that there is that possibility, or that percentage of people who have had traumatic lives but aren't able to function very well. So I just urge some caution about that, but it's probably not a true violation. You know, I'm going to send some stuff to Gregory, alias Dr. Stewart, and maybe we can put that out. But I urge you periodically just to take a look at the literature.
And the next question is a two-part question. What are some signs that a person that gambles every so often is starting to form a gambling addiction? And when a social worker sees the addiction is forming, what should he or she do?
Okay, so the question is, what are some of the signs that someone who gambles occasionally are getting into trouble with it, perhaps developing a problem? And what should a social worker do if they see that? You know, some of the signs will be like we see with alcohol and drug addiction. It might be preoccupation. We'll often see the financial losses. So the person is beginning to struggle financially because of the losses sustained in gambling, or the gambling is taking up more time. Perhaps they have missed family occasions, or they've been late to work or late back to work. I knew a guy that would gamble on his lunch hour, and one of the ways that popped up was that he started not coming back to work on time after lunch. So you're going to see some of those signs. My recommendation is that you think in our stages of change. And so as you're getting aware that they have a problem, and you look to that matrix on what's the appropriate intervention at this stage of change, perhaps if it's pre-contemplative, you might go, you know, you've been talking about the casino a lot lately. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And maybe they go on and say it, and maybe you can say something as kind of neutral as, well, you know, I've been learning a lot about gambling, and it's, gosh, we have a lot of risk factors these days. And begin the conversation that way. Or, you know, you said that, you know, you missed your daughter's birthday because you were at the casino. Gosh, how does that feel? Did you lose track of time? What was going on? I know how important your daughter is. So I use those stages of change a lot. I am hopeful that we begin to incorporate gambling language and questions into our assessments. So just like we've learned to incorporate trauma and alcohol and other drugs, if we can incorporate gambling questions, concerns into our general language and assessment, we send the message that it's okay to talk about it. So it's a lot like when we're in training and they say, you know, like, you don't go, have you beaten your wife lately? So it's kind of like, we don't say, do you have a problem with gambling? And even I still work part-time for Addiction Services Council, and in their assessment, as is in many, there are the 4 questions around gambling, and then if they answer yes, you go to a more extended survey. But the way the questions are worded, and their legitimate survey tested all of that, I wouldn't answer them even if I had a problem, because the implication in the languaging is that there's a problem. So my hope is that we get to where we include, just like I say, so when was the last time you had alcohol, or when was the last time you had a drink, or, you know, rather than say, do you use cannabis? How much cannabis do you use in a week? That will start like, okay, tell me about, did you play in this recent lottery, the Mega Millions? Okay, what about scratch offs, bingo, gaming? We have that whole list that both educates people as to all the levels of gambling, but helps it be presented as it's okay to answer yes. So that's kind of a long answer to that, but it is part of the challenge of incorporating this into our work. And remember, just like with alcohol and drug addiction, the majority of people struggling are not going to necessarily show up asking for that kind of treatment. You're going to be hopefully intervening and seeing it even when someone comes to you for some other issue, but that we begin to take a look at the full kind of holistic thing, which includes these social trends of which gambling is one. So that's my long answer to that.
There are currently no other questions. But,
Okay.
if you could just say, keep them coming.
Yeah, keep your questions coming. I mean, this helps me, helps you, and helps your colleagues, because the more that we share about this, the more that we learn. So we're going to move into talking about the therapeutic relationship. And again, it's kind of back to basics, but I think it's an important thing for us to remember. And for me, it's an important thing to remember in that the nature of my therapeutic relationship is slightly different depending on the issue that my client is presenting with. And being aware of that helps me do better work. So this is my relatively lame attempt at drawing a therapeutic relationship, and I'll have to get help with this because I don't know how to do shading. But the point of this is that your client's blue and you're red, okay? And you come together, but the relationship exists in that space between you. So a little bit of you, a little bit of them, but we're not so enmeshed that I'm not separate, because it's in that space that we work. So in your therapeutic relationship, regardless of the nature of it, there's a constant exchange of verbal, nonverbal, communication, feelings. It's a constant exchange. And I think of myself as a counselor or social worker or therapist, because I think of myself as the instrument that the client's nonverbals, verbals, what they bring to the table comes into me, and I process it through my knowledge, my skills, my experience, and I attempt to then communicate to them in the way that's most likely going to increase their self-awareness, their self-efficacy, their ability to positively deal with the issues they bring to the table. So it requires, as you guys know, an ability to process a lot of stuff simultaneously. The more kind of gender, race, ethnicity, religion, that kind of coloration that everyone brings to the table, but also to start grasping based on their response to me what that defensive structure is like, what intervention might be most successful. So it's this constant exchange. But the reason for our therapeutic boundaries is the work takes place in the space. For me, it's why I can't do therapeutic work with a friend of mine or a family member, because when I'm with them, we're closer, we're more touching. And so I'm not going to push a friend to feel her pain. I'm not going to analyze a friend based on her defenses. For me, it's a totally different mindset. So when I'm in my therapeutic space or my professional space, I'm looking at a lot of different aspects and I'm taking them in and factoring them in. It's almost like I turn that off when I'm with you in an intimate relationship or as a friend or as a colleague. And I don't know if that fits for people are like, do you diagnose your friends? No, I do not. I'm not in that mindset. I wouldn't want to be in that mindset. Maybe the reason I've been able to do this work for 40 years is because I'm not in that mindset. I think of it as an art form, almost a performance art. It's my profession. Certain things about me made it more likely that I could be a decent counselor. My nature, my character, actually, my crazy family and my addicted husband brought me to a lot of understanding. But I don't walk around diagnosing my friends, nor do I want to fix them, and in fact would urge them to get fixed somewhere else. But this is the nature of our therapeutic relationship, and this is what we're going to protect. So just keep that in mind. You are the instrument of your work. And so that's why we have to pay attention to self-care. It's just like you change the oil in your car. And if you don't, you're going to run into trouble. You don't keep up with your own self-care. We'll look at a couple of aspects of that, because it isn't just like getting your nails done or taking a vacation. But if you don't keep this instrument honed and sharp, your work is going to suffer. So we said a little bit about this before break. This therapeutic relationship will be played out differently depending on the context. So that would include your goal. So what is this client coming to you for? Or what are you delivering to your client? What's your product? What's your service? So it would be different if I'm working with a couple. It's different than if I'm working with an individual. If I'm working as a case manager, it's different than if I'm working as a peer supporter. So my goal will help define my role with that person. And so the context of our relationship will be different based on those roles. For instance, me with the woman at Bob Evans, had I been her peer supporter or her home worker or someone who had been in her home or who had shared food before, it would have been less intense than it being someone with whom I already had a somewhat defined goal. So I had worked with her around intervening on her brother's addiction, and now she was coming with a different problem. And I think I was way too casual. Now it worked out, but the conflict between us could have been avoided had I thought more thoroughly through what the nature of this new role and goal was going to be. So if you're a case manager, you may transport people, you may go to their home. If that's not your role, that can start to move you into a dual relationship, the challenge of which it dilutes that primary goal. So that's the challenge with it. And once that role is diluted, the role changes. And it also depends on who your audience is. So for instance, if your primary client group is like when I worked in the jails, I had a different kind of role and I had different kind of boundaries that were relevant to that role of working in the jail. So like them borrowing my cell phone in the context of working in the jail was very different than if I had a client say, oh, can I use your phone to call my mother? It was very different. So let's keep in mind our population and how they view us in light of that and what's our primary goal. So it's going to be played out in different contexts, which is why it's hard sometimes to say what's a dual relationship. Any relationship outside of that primary goal or role. So as we look at this, we're also going to pay attention, and I know this sounds old school, but we live this all the time. Transference, so what my client assumes about me or projects onto me based on the information they have at hand. So even if I don't know you, you can have thoughts, feelings, associations, and I think we all do. Part of it's just learning to be aware, and the more experience you have, more associations you have. So I'm a Caucasian woman with white hair, and I'm wearing a pink sweater, and And so people can have assumptions, they can transfer projections onto me based on just these superficial pieces. The more we interact, the more information you have that will flesh out your transference or your assumptions about me. The more experience you have as an individual with different people, the more diverse your assumptions or transference might be. And it might be to the point that you make no like really big assumptions about somebody because you know so many people more like them. So in that old psychoanalytic approach, which in the purest form was, we allowed the transference to take place because it would be in the context of that the healing would take place. So let's say, for instance, you're on probation and you come to see me and your probation officer has got like, this guy's got a gambling problem. You come to see me. That initial transference will be usually me as authority figure. The initial transference will be a lot about my superficial presentation, you know, my race, my age, all those kinds of things. That in the context of that, at some point, hopefully you start to see me maybe as a person in authority, but a person in authority who is helpful. So we're aware of that transference and we're going to use it and hopefully help it heal. I assume that makes sense. My counter transference is what I bring to the table about you and the associations that I make and the assumptions that I make because of how you present to me. And that will be based, just like everything else, on my experiences, my personal life. It's interesting, when I was preparing for this, and looking at some literature around a boundary crossing, which occurs when I assume that you're like me. So when I was doing this work, hopefully this doesn't sound too crazy, there was a couple of times in my work with clients that I was almost aware of a parallel narrative that was my story with their story. That makes sense, which I think is fine, but it was just what they were presenting was something that is kind of a deep semi-wound for me. And so I felt this like parallel story. Well, the trick in that is to know it's a parallel story and not to assume that her experience, however similar, is the same as my experience. I mean, it might help me to empathize with her, well, really more identify. So remember, identification is not empathy. But if I were to make my story her story, that would be a boundary crossing. That's taking away the space where we operate and making us kind of one for a minute. So it was a piece of literature I was reading, and it really kind of clicked in for me as I watched myself. And when we think about self-disclosure, those are the times too where I'm self-disclosing. And we do a lot of that in addiction that we don't often do in traditional mental health. But the self-disclosure ethically should all be about the well-being and welfare of that client. So I should be able to predict the impact that my self-disclosure is going to have on my client and on their progress and the nature of our therapeutic relationship. If I can't predict it, it's probably inappropriate. Or think of it like my mom used to say, if you think you've got to do it, don't. So if you feel a real urge to disclose something, check it for a minute and make sure you're disclosing in service of your client and not just because you don't know what else to do or because you feel like it. And you can usually tell if your self-disclosure bombed, and then you either apologize or you just know not to do it again, but keep that in mind. This whole notion of gifts is one that comes up, and it can be particularly problematic in gambling because, as I said, many of them will come to get help because of finances. The gift carries meaning. So we're going to evaluate that gift in terms of our therapeutic relationship and in terms of the meaning that gift has to the giver. So it's not so much what it means to me, but what does it mean to the giver? Is this a person who gets their sense of self-worth through gift giving? Is this a person who's having a hard time tolerating that the relationship is focused on them? Generally, they're paying a fee or somebody's paying for them. So is this somebody who perhaps is hoping to manipulate you? What's the meaning of the gift in terms of the giver? In terms of the therapeutic relationship, how you handle that gift will impact how that person feels, whether they feel accepted or rejected, whether they understand the nature of your acceptance or rejection, and they evaluate it in terms of that relationship. So in general, we look at cost, we look at culture, we look at the organization itself, and we look at trying to frame for people the appropriateness or inappropriateness of gift giving. So if you're in an organization and somebody brings you a gift, you can easily say, you know, I'm not allowed to accept gifts, but I'd be glad to share this with other people. Or if it's something that can't be shared, oh, I'm not able to accept gifts. Is this something, you know, maybe you'd like to donate? I try at holidays to kind of talk through that with people if I sense they can tolerate it. You know, it's the holidays, and you know, we're probably going to have some cookies and stuff here. You know, I don't want you to feel like you need to bring me anything. I know it's awkward. If in fact the gift is something that you know is of great meaning and it's not a high value, sometimes it's easier just to accept the gift. So think in terms of your audience. I do caution people about taking homemade food from clientele. As I say, make sure they like you before you eat it. But also, you know, it's a germy, we live in a germy environment. I just took CPR training yesterday, and we're no longer doing mouth to mouth, even on the dummies, by the way, because of COVID and all the precautions. Socializing can be another issue, particularly if your friend group is similar to their friend group. So it's not that you have to be rude, but you do have to remember you are in a special relationship with this person. And when you're on display, your relationship is on display. If you think that's going to happen a lot, I would talk about it ahead of time. You know, I know we have some similar friends and we're probably going to run into each other. I want you to know that I'm not going to disclose anything about you. And if I'm not spending a lot of time with you, it's because I want to protect this relationship, because you don't want them feeling rejected. Or if it would happen by surprise, you might bring it up later. You know, we have a notion now of boundary crossing as opposed to boundary violation. And I think this has been a good evolution in our thinking. Early in my career, I had a client who was dying of cancer, and I would not visit her in the hospital because I thought it was a boundary violation. That's a big regret, because I think that she would have been comforted by having me around at the end. And it also almost felt awkward because we had been involved for a long time, and suddenly we're not involved anymore. So as that's evolved over time, and certainly I've evolved over time, I do think we have to look to the kind of humanity in the situation. and the ego strength or ability of our client to handle a kind of slight switch in the relationship. And here, the example that comes to mind for me, having worked for a long time in addiction, would be the death of someone that I had worked with. And usually if it was me, I had worked with the family, the death of them related to overdose. I did go to many a memorial service because it just felt like the right thing to do. Now, if people said, how do you know so-and-so? I'd just be like, we just know each other from being around, it does, nobody, when they ask you that, rarely do they really care. So nobody knew why I was there. But to me, to not be present at that point for that family when I had been present with them while they tried to intervene or while the person struggled, seemed to be, inhumane as well as not therapeutic. So in the old days, that might have been considered totally taboo. It is not really considered taboo now, but you have to remember your primary relationship is your therapeutic relationship. It's not like suddenly now I'm your friend because your partner or your child has passed away. Our relationship is still primarily therapeutic. You all know if you change that dynamic and you become friends, there's no going back. And I just think there's probably few situations where you really need to make that change. In addiction, there's some writing that speaks to recovery. So the writing around this topic there is that I meet you in the kind of active phase of your addiction, and then you get into solid recovery. So is the nature of our relationship different once you're in solid recovery? And I guess I want to say a few things. My respect for you is equal. But in our relationship, there is not an equal exchange of intimacy or an equal exchange of vulnerability when I'm your counselor or your worker and you're my client. In social relationships, there'll be some percentage of exchange, but that exchange is usually equal. So like, I think I have tier 1 friends, which I'd say almost anything to. Tier 2 friends, I'm pretty close to. I have a bunch of tier 3 friends that I say are friends, but really we're acquaintances. I'm not going to tell them anything really personal or anything vulnerable. So those are generally equal exchanges. So if you make that transition, as I know happens in real life, there is no going back. So we cannot effectively work with people who are our personal friends or family members. If you're in recovery, this is just a warning to protect your recovery. And this comes into self-care. And know that your role, again, as social worker, counselor is different than your role as members of a self-help group or in a more social recovery environment. You've got to respect your recovery, protect your recovery first, because that's who you are and that is part of your instrument. So any questions about this stuff? I mean, I know we talk about it a lot. It's amazing how much it comes up. I think particularly around holidays, it comes up in different ways if you do home visits or if you transport people where you're in that more intimate environment with them. So if you come to my office, you're not going to automatically feel the same social intimacy as you'd feel as if you were in my car or I were in your home. Those of you who might engage in residential, you know that the whole environment becomes kind of your office, and it means you're viewed in ways that you don't necessarily pay attention to. So this stuff varies depending on the nature of your relationship. For me, it's easiest in an office environment because that feels very clear, very clean. It was harder when I worked more on the streets and in people's homes, because you just knew more about them and you were in their space and you know, met their dog and all this kind of stuff. So it would feel very different. Any questions, guys, or thoughts? You like, I only take a gift if it's really big. It's like, if it's really big, you run, change your fingerprints, get plastic surgery. Has to be really big these days though, guys, really big. You know, this Mega Millions is a great example of a little bit about gambling. Many people who don't even buy a ticket have feelings of euphoria when they think what they're going to do when they win. I mean, just think for a minute, what would you do if you won the Mega Millions? It gives us a little clue into what it feels like when you have a win in gambling. It's like, oh, wow, that happened. I mean, so it is, we get a lot of frenzy about this, and on break, we were talking a little bit. So pay attention, watch the amount of commercials are going on around gambling right now. And I listen to that, whatever it's called. I call it Sirius Radio. I think it's Series or something. I don't know, whatever. But it's amazing, even there, all the stuff for DraftKings and all these stuff. I have to say, the fact that Pete Rose was Cincinnati's spokesperson really hurt my heart. Now, it might not have hurt Pete's heart, but I'm like, your life was like ruined by this. And now you're our like mascot. Anyway, personal commentary. I don't know that it bothered Pete. God only knows how much money he made doing that, but yeah, I don't know. Okay, so we've talked about this. Any relationship outside of my primary one. Remember, our boundaries are all of these things: time, place, the goals we set for each other is a boundary. So I contract with you via my treatment plan to work on these things. That's what we're working on. It's like a contract. If we need to change that, I think that should be over. You know, I've been working with you for a while, and I have to say, I think we focus over here, you're gonna have more success. The role, touch is a boundary. I think we're very aware that not everyone is comfortable with touch. And especially when you don't know someone, asking permission for touch is probably a good idea. I think we've increased our sensitivity to trauma and the impact that may have on touch. Touch is also a social and cultural norm. So handshaking, hugs, how close you stand to people, all of these things are boundaries. And to assume that my boundaries are your boundaries is probably an erroneous assumption. So it's just something to be aware of. I also think if you work particularly in a group context, when you hug one person, everybody knows you hug them. And so that could be interpreted by other clients as favoritism or inappropriate. And if we don't explicitly say, if you're a hugging group, you know, make sure people who aren't comfortable hugging feel free to not hug. We exert this kind of social pressure without realizing it, which can make the non-huggers feel really uncomfortable. It's the same with like when you hold hands and close a meeting, or just be very aware that touch carries both personal and cultural messaging to it. And our orientation may not be somebody else's orientation. So we're going to talk for a minute about how we end up in trouble with this. And a couple of biases. I I think we need to remember that this stuff can happen to any of us, given the right circumstances and the right vulnerability. And, you know, I've shared this in other trainings, and I'll share it again, I had an experience years and years ago. I was newly single and feeling insecure about that. And I got a client who was extremely handsome and actually fairly wealthy, which was rare in my job. And he was incredibly charming. My vulnerability combined with his kind of mode of operating, which was to charm his way out of anything, ended up in a very high risk situation. Now, I can't say anything happened, but I remember, thank goodness I had a supervisor, going to the supervisor because I was very troubled by this. This guy had called and asked me to join him in a cabin and asked me to dinner, and I was struggling. What my supervisor was able to show me, and it was actually a consulting psychiatrist, so it was probably easier because they weren't in my organization, was how I, over time, had started to dress differently when I saw him, act differently when I saw him, wear different perfume when I saw him. So unconsciously, I had fed in to what could have been a disastrous dual relationship. And what the supervisor also reminded me of was it might not be my client who got hurt, it might be me. So what we see with these ethical violations, particularly when they involve relationships, they tend to happen over time. When we look at and analyze the situations when people end up in a dual relationship, particularly sexual or friendship wise, and then we'll talk about money and other stuff. It usually happens over time. People rarely set out to be a perpetrator and say, you know, who can I get with that's in my group today? It includes opportunity. So when we think about prevention, we want to think about those things in an environment that might create a sense of opportunity for someone who's not able to control perhaps their impulses, or whose natural defensive style is to engage in intimate, emotional, or sexual relationships in order to gain power. So here's an example. When you work alone at night and people know you're alone, it can give the illusion of opportunity. And so a prevention would be not to let that happen, or to make sure that somebody knows that there's other people in the building. This is the same with theft or anything. You know how that goes. The illusion of opportunity put out to the universe means those of us who have that tendency are going to take advantage. So keep that in mind. And so the way that I conduct myself, there was a client I saw late at night in my private practice, and I tend to work later than other people, not because I'm so awesome, but because I only want to work 3 days a week. So, and what I realized was I locked the door, and then I took this client back to my office, and I thought, whoa, I just gave this guy the message that we're alone in this building. Now, nothing happened, but I changed after that. I don't know. And listen, you know what? Depending on where you are in your life, there may be transference stuff that's different. So when I was younger, it was more about dating relationships. You know what? I don't think this guy thought, well, I got a really hot old lady, but it's still, it gives an opportunity for awkwardness. And who knows how he feels? Maybe he thought, you know, he would worry about me. But go conservative on this. I just think it's better to avoid those kinds. We used to tell my dad when he was unfortunately in a nursing home, do you know how many particular older men feel like they always have to have cash on them? Like, if I don't have cash, I mean, I don't even carry cash anymore, but if I don't have cash, we'll be like, Dad, when you have cash in your robe, it's a natural temptation to some poor aide who makes minimum wage. And then if the aide gets caught stealing from you, they lose their job. So let's practice prevention. Many times it's when we're vulnerable. So as we get to the end and we talk about areas to watch, my vulnerability, whether relationship oriented, emotional, financial, increases the likelihood I will have an ethical challenge in that arena. Sometimes it involves us trying to be really helpful. Sometimes it's we over-identify with the situation of the individual and we want to help, but we go too far in that helping. Rarely is it premeditated. So the percentage of these issues that happen, again, like I said, because the social worker themselves is some kind of predator, is really very low. It's usually one of these situational things. If you are familiar with Billy Graham at all, he, and I think I say this, I hope it was him, would not be alone in an elevator with a woman because he didn't want that ever to come into question. So remember too, you might hurt your client, but your client might hurt you. So it's better to just guard against some of this. Okay, so we have boundary crossings and we have boundary violations. Boundary crossings are usually unintentional and low. You go to Mitchell's salon and you look over and there's your client works there. That's a boundary crossing. That's not a boundary violation. You, when she comes in, says, let me give you a discount on your next haircut, and you do it, that's a boundary violation. So we live in community, we're going to have a lot of crossover. And I do think, like I said, there's some of this was in many ways unnatural, although if you look way back in the psychoanalytic literature, there were many social crossovers, because all the people who actually went for therapy tend to be in the same social class. But just know there's violations and there's crossings. And if you're in a small community and the only auto mechanic happens to be a client of yours, I think you need to address that openly and do everything you can to make sure you're paying exact market price. It's just, if you can avoid it, avoid it. What happens if your brakes fail? Or what happens if you get a bad haircut? I mean, all of these things become complications. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we make these decisions and kind of see where you are with that. And then I want to make sure we talk about self-care and compassion fatigue, because these are occupational hazards that I think we need to kind of be conscious of. You know, I met with a woman a couple weeks ago who works in a children's facility, and she's struggling with her daughter. And a piece of what she's struggling with is really related to her work. She is so kind of fatigued by the childhood trauma in her work that she then is kind of desensitized to her daughter. And I really think it's an occupational hazard. So what we're working on is trying to find, you know, some additional boundaries there and additional ways to work, which may mean confronting her supervisor. So many times in our jobs, resources are not adequate. And so we tend to overwork, or we tend to expect the people that we manage to overwork to always make up for this lack. And instead, we might need to advocate around the lack, because we can create really unhealthy environments that will cost our clients at some point. But you know, your longevity as a professional is somewhat based on your ability to find satisfaction in your job and perhaps even some joy, but keep yourself as a tuned instrument. And I don't know how I learned that, but I feel like early in my career, because I have like Zippo boundaries in my personal life, but early in my career, I think because I was taught to view my work more like a skilled tradesperson, or like it's like, so rather than like I had some special gift, that early on I was pretty much able to let work go at work. I did not like carry it through the rest of my life and view my work and my interest in my work as I'm always looking for something new to learn. And that's kept me, I think, loving our profession. But when it comes to ethical decision making, there's a couple of questions we want to ask ourselves. There's a lot of models out there. I think what's important is just that you take it seriously and you get a little methodical about it so that it pushes you to critical thinking instead of just jumping to an assumption. One question I use is this ethical? Like I said, is this clinical? Like, I'm not sure I agree with you clinically, or I'm not sure clinically what my next move is, or is this ethical? What principle is involved? Is this, about client welfare? It almost probably always is. Is this about approach? Is this about confidentiality? Is this about HIPAA? What is the nature of the principle that's involved here? If I take action A, who might be helped? So I'm thinking through, well, I think it would help my client, it might help my career. Wrong answer, but who might be helped? And then who might be harmed? So if I engage in this behavior and today this feels like it might be good, what's that going to look like next month? What if I spin this out? So it's kind of like when, like somebody, your client asks you for bus fare or for a cigarette or for anything. Once you give it once, where's that going to end? So spin it out a little bit and think, is this a precedent I want to set? Am I putting myself in a position where I'm going to have to backtrack or go, I know that was okay last week, but this week it's not okay. Better to think in the beginning than think in the end. Do I need feedback? Who can I talk to that I can say, help me think this through? What do you think? I'm real conservative. I already told you that. So I had a client in my private practice. She had a jacket. She didn't want it. She left it for me. I mean, I about spazzed out. First of all, I'm not used to working with people who have extra jackets. And so I consulted. It's like, what does this mean in the relationship? Should I accept this? How do I talk about it? So this person helped me. I went back the next week and discussed it with this client. The decision was that the jacket would go to Goodwill because I'm so conservative. I have to say there would have been no harm in taking it, but I got feedback. And another question is, and this can be Fox News or CNN, or what am I going to say about this when I'm questioned? So what's my justification going to be? And when you look at legality of violations, am I performing or behaving in a manner that most people in my profession would agree with and handle it the same way? So if you're following the Rust and the shooting of the cinematographer, and I'll blank on the actor's name, but part of that debate is, what is the standard of care in his profession for arms? So we're going to go, what's the standard of care in social work, counseling, behavioral health for how we deal with this? And if I can justify it in that standard of care, it's probably okay. So really, you have to have the courage to give feedback and to accept feedback. There's a video that's out there called Crossing the Boundary or something, but it takes place in a treatment program within a jail. And what this video shows is that this relationship between the social worker and the inmate started to develop personally over time. What it also shows is how many signs her coworkers saw that she was getting in trouble with this guy. And nobody said a word until it became a horrible, tragic situation. When we see these things, when we think, oh gosh, Greg spends a lot of time with Lisa, or when we're like, that hug was a little long, or when we're like, I saw you doing favors, or when we're like, I can tell you're not feeling good. We need to have the courage to give that feedback. It doesn't have to be judgmental. It shouldn't be accusatory, but why would we not want to intervene if we're concerned that something horrible might happen? So we need to have that courage, and we need to have people around us who are willing to give us that kind of feedback. So, it's not okay when Greg's in trouble ethically that we all go, gosh, I saw it coming. You know what? Last week he blah, 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 blah. If we saw it, we should have said something. That's kind of part of our ethical responsibility to our field and to our fellow professionals. We have any questions?
So we are getting a few.
Okay.
There was one earlier, I'm not sure if you addressed it. Do you mean you were comparing your own experience with the client's experience or blending them when you were talking about that?
Okay, here's the question. Was I comparing my experience to my clients, or was I blending it? I mean, I think that's the critical question. I'll tell you, for me, it was almost like a trauma loop, if that makes sense. She was talking and I got this parallel train from my own life. And so I set aside the parallel train. So what I do in my head is go, oh my God, that's about me. And I kind of bookmark it or set it aside. And then I'll go back later in my own head and go, God bless it. Where did that come from? So I think your question is the trick. In some ways, okay, so we know that in terms of effective therapeutic encounters, no matter what your approach, no matter what manual you use, no matter what, there's key features that research tells us make a difference, right? Genuineness is one, so authenticity. You really can't fake it for that long. So authenticity, trustworthiness, so I do what I say, and respect. So I respect you as a human, and your kind of right to make your own, determine your own life, and empathy. So we have to remember empathy is our ability to view the world, cognitions, feelings from someone else's viewpoint. Identification is not empathy. So we have to watch that comparison. So I may get some inkling about your feelings from my life experience. If we use the word worked through. If I've integrated an experience from my life, and I'm no longer afraid of my feelings about that, then I'm going to be able to tolerate yours. So sometimes what happens to us is something's unfinished or unintegrated in me. I'm not sure it ever goes away, but unintegrated. So I can't really take you in because of my own resistance to the pain that you feel, which mirrors my own. So watch the comparison. Identification might give us a clue, but identification is not empathy. So we want to be able to ask ourselves, so in this case, I was kind of off and running, so I had to shut it down. In another case, like I have a strong interest in family work, and that's because of my family experience with addiction and chronic illness and all of that. And I always felt families didn't get the attention they deserved. And it would be like, don't, show me another movie. We need help here. And so I can say to myself, okay, I felt this. I wonder if Greg's feeling this. But then I might want to say to Greg, gosh, I'm wondering, are you feeling like really angry about this? That's different than my empathizing, and I can feel Greg's anger. So they're all tools, but we want to remember that identification isn't empathy, and empathy only matters if I can communicate it. Does that make sense? Let's see, does that make sense? Yeah, because it's just, we've all got issues, so to me, it's like whether I've integrated them in, and I've made some mistakes, guys, where I'll catch myself, where really what my feedback was more about me than it was about them. And I'm lucky if it was on target, but sometimes I can feel it. I'll be like, oh gosh, no, that was me, not them.
Okay, so there's some comments.
Okay.
This is great information. Thank you. It is helpful to review relationships, boundaries, and clients. The simple fact that this has been added to the DSM-VTR now is huge wake-up call. And now we have a couple more questions. Can a social worker lose their license if they are medically diagnosed with a gambling addiction?
Okay, can a social worker lose their license if they're medically diagnosed with a gambling addiction? My understanding is absolutely not. And if you would lose your job because you have a gambling addiction, then you call us and we'll advocate for you. What you can lose your job from is the things you do with a gambling addiction to keep your gambling addiction going. Fraud, stealing. But no, and I think we have to embrace this, guys, because, this is a percentage game. So like 3 to 5% of people who gamble will develop a problem. I don't think we all have to never touch a card or go to a casino. So that means in our pool of humans as social workers, some of us are going to have problems. So we need to be there, for each other as well, because so do not be afraid to seek help. But on a practical level, I'd be careful who you seek help from. Okay. I just think you want to be careful because people can be gossipy.
Then what is the legal age for sports gambling? Is it 18 or 21?
I think it's 21. We will clear. Yeah, it's 21. The problem is with online, it's so difficult to verify that, and so many ways around it. But so as you move into this treatment part, hopefully, I don't know how far they'll get, but know that Problem Gambling Network of Ohio has lots of training available, and things are progressing. So yeah, there's also some technological ways to block people from gambling, like 14-year-olds in your house. But yeah, it's 21.
And the last question is, could you provide an example of unrequested feedback?
Okay, so the question is of unrequested feedback. Can you say a little more about that, questioner?
Do you want me to allow them to talk?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, Laura, we're gonna turn you on so you can talk.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it was when you were talking about if you see someone like maybe slipping into some behavior that no one is saying anything about. And um, so they're not requesting some feedback about the situation. Like, I don't know, I guess just like an example of how
Yeah,
to provide some feedback without, them requesting it, essentially.
okay, Laura, thanks. And I think it's a very delicate situation and it can be really hard. So I guess I would think you want to be as gentle as is possible and realistic. I mean, I say realistic in your employment environment because I know some environments are safer than others. But I guess if I felt really strongly about something, I might say something like, this might not be my business, but I've been a little bit concerned about what I've seen. And maybe it's me, maybe, but I just felt like I needed to say this. So I would ask myself, kind of like I would ask myself about any ethical dilemma, is this me disagreeing with your clinical approach? Because that's not ethical. I mean, that's not an ethical issue. That's a disagreement about clinical approach. Or is it that I've got a concern about something else? Yeah, so does that help at all? It's a very delicate situation and probably if you're seeing something, you work pretty closely with somebody. But, or maybe if it's, they're going through a tough time and you think it's affecting their work, but it can feel really judgmental to say it's affecting your work. Maybe you just say to somebody, I know you're having a tough time right now. It can be really hard, especially in our line of work. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. So you're kind of bringing it to their awareness, but not being judgmental. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's tough stuff. I mean, it's tough stuff. And it just, I guess for me, sometimes I'll feel, particularly having worked in addiction, somebody will relapse and then other people will go, well, I knew it. I saw it coming. I'm like, this person has a potentially fatal illness and you saw all the signs and you didn't say anything. Well, then don't gossip about them now is part of it for me. But it is hard. But I think if we could cultivate a culture where we felt safe, we could probably take care of a lot of this stuff. But thanks. Any other questions or comments?
That's it for now.
Okay. Okay, guys, we're going to kind of move into the self-care part, which means we won't in this environment get to do any case studies, but know that there's stuff available through PGNO and through the university. But in our line of work, it can alter our worldview. So when you work with a specific population, over time, you can start to see the whole world that way. So like when I worked in adult protective, I pretty much started to think that everybody over 65 like ate cat food because that's all I saw. We work in some very difficult environments that also can make us hyper alert with good reason or become much more like that environment and it take on some of those characteristics. So I think for me, one of the examples was when I worked for a while in the jail, I could feel my mentality shifting a little bit and I actually cussed a lot more on the outside because I was in that environment all the time where we had a lot of cussing. We also can start to see the world in terms of pathology because that's what we deal with. And rather than seeing the world perhaps in a more optimistic view. So we just want to be careful at that. One of the things that I do see is that we may be overly cautious about certain things or get judgmental just based on our work, not necessarily judgmental in an anti-political way. When I worked primarily with overdose response, I mean, I started to kind of profile folks, and I probably was correct, but what that reflected was a shift in my worldview, or I'd kind of scan an environment and I'd be picking out the heroin users. So, I mean, it's just a skew, and I think we have to remember that. So burnout tends to be exhaustion and can happen in any place. And we need to look at life balance, and that workaholism is highly rewarded in American society, but you will pay a price, and so will your family. But compassion fatigue, let's remember, is secondary traumatization. So I am in many ways absorbing the trauma, being a witness. So I either see the event, but a witness to the story. So as I listen to your narrative the way I need to, with open to empathy, I can be impacted on that secondary traumatization level by your narrative, by your story. What I think about it is like dust then on my therapeutic lens. So it's not healthy physically or emotionally. It also can start to alter the clarity with which we see the situation we're engaged in now. So we think about this with first responders. We think about this with our digital world. We're often viewing human tragedy in a way that we might not have 30 years ago. But remember, it's also in the telling of the story. And particularly human on human trauma is far more assaultive to our spirit than natural disasters. So we want to recognize that, which means we can do some things to prevent it. I want to give you a little bit of advice for secondary traumatization, and then we want to look at the whole realm of self-care. But with regard to secondary traumatization, if you can affiliate with a team who understands the nature of your work, that can help. Just like we do chronic or critical incident debriefing, you can do that among yourselves. So where you let somebody know that you had a really tough session, or you heard some really painful things, or you're doing a community intervention and it doesn't go the way you hoped. Take a step back, take a look at what happened, just like we do in critical incident debriefing. Even for me individually, I want to look back and think, what could I have done differently? What would I do differently next time? You know, what happened? So I'm closing that situation down rather than carrying it undigested, if that makes sense. So if I can talk about it, process it out, particularly in some cases, if I have a compassionate witness, which might be a colleague, I mean, that's not always necessary, but I like knowing that if something really bothers me, I have a colleague I can share it with. So just like a compassionate witness builds resilience in a traumatic environment, a compassionate witness helps us to not absorb that. But you know, and it's not like this stuff is horrible, but like an example I use is that when my son was growing up, I don't think I let my son go in a men's bathroom by himself until he was 12. That was a direct result of the work that I did, and I was hyper conscious. And then I remember standing at Jungle Gyms outside the bathroom going, you know, you touch him and I'm coming for you. I mean, it's just, but that, so just know this stuff happens, and we want to know, and you know, keep in mind you might be taking it out on your family, but just that's important for our health, but it's also important for the quality of your work. We've all met people we think should have retired years ago because they're burnouts. You don't want to be one. So now I just for a minute want to talk about self-care. So this comes from, and I'm going to try to send it to Greg, but this comes from, there's a lot of these holistic assessments. This is the whole person inventory for counselors, which we'll make available to you if you're interested. It's by Sharon Wakescheider Cruz, but it looks specifically at us as helpers and how this plays out. But we want to look at all aspects of our life, physical, of course, because we're at our best when we're physically well. And we all know how chronic pain or chronic illness can really impact our performance, or how acute illness can. Emotional. Where I'm emotionally balanced and emotionally fulfilled, I'm at my best. If I'm emotionally drained, if I feel emotionally isolated, my likelihood that I am going to over-identify with you, or to make your problem my problem, or my problem your problem, that I'm going to cross that boundary is much more likely than if I'm emotionally feel balanced or trust that I have resources. Socially, if you've got enough friends, your clients don't need to be your friends. Mental is not just your mental health, but your intellectual health. So have I read anything recently? Have I gone to a training other than the ones that I'm forced to do? Have I looked at any of the new research? Have I kept my intellectual functioning at a high enough level that I'm doing my job well? The spiritual in this is more this sense of optimism about and connectedness to humanity. Hopefulness. If we are working in a population where we don't see a lot of recovery or success, we can become as hopeless as our clientele. So it's something to pay attention to, and make sure that you have input in your life, which is filling you back up, which I know sounds so corny, but it's so true. Look at the dopamine, serotonin literature, and that'll help you realize you got to keep yourself full. Volitional has to do with, do I feel like I'm an actor in my own life? Do I feel stuck, or do I feel I'm able to have goals and achieve them? Do I have dreams? Do I have hopes? That all of these components are necessary for us to stay at our best for our families, our friends, but also our clients.
Oh, wait a second. No.
There we go. This is something a mentor of mine told me, and I use this all the time, and it's really helped my life. It's not just about getting rid of the bad stuff. It's a great deal about adding in more good stuff. So if your job is stressing you out, sometimes you don't have to quit your job. Sometimes you need to put more good stuff in, which may mean taking a little time off, or it may be seeking out a hobby, or it may be paying attention to what makes me feel fulfilled, what makes me feel good. So don't just look at the bad stuff you want to get rid of. Look at how much good stuff you're bringing in. And here's our other thing, right? If you always do what you always did, you will always get what you always got. So if you're struggling, what's your plan? Make a commitment to some level of self-care. Make a commitment to some of these newer trainings. You're going to need your CEUs anyway. You might as well get them in something that's interesting. And problem gambling is a workforce issue. So you're investing in your future, because we are really in need of people with gambling expertise. So not only is it stimulating, it's a good investment for your career. So do we have any final comments or questions?
So in the last 30 minutes,
Yeah.
I sent all the participants an email.
Okay.
So we did a test, they got my,
Yay.
they got my information. Now we're ready for Monica to deploy the survey.
Okay.
So go ahead and say that so they can hear it.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we just tested email and now we're gonna deploy the survey.
So Monica's gonna do that.
Monica's gonna do that for you and you know, I'm just encouraging you, let Greg, let these folks know what information you want, what information you need, because they can help bring this stuff back to you depending on what you want and need. And I guess you guys, thank you so much.
She's waiting.
I mean, I love this stuff and I hope this was useful.
And so Nan, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, are you involved with the?
Yeah, I am. Okay, Problem Gambling Network of Ohio has kind of become my new tribe for this. And it's a statewide organization. I have to tell you, Ohio is kind of ahead of the game on a lot of the things that we have done around problem gambling. We have a warm transfer hotline. We've got this workforce development. So I don't remember what it costs to be a member, but I think it's a worthwhile investment. They offer a lot of free or low cost training. You get a newsletter. It really helps you keep up with what's going on in problem gambling. They do have a conference coming up. If you go on their website, you'll see it. Like I said earlier, that's a place too to get some highly specific topics, but also some of the research. If you're interested in prevention, they have links to many of the prevention activities, as does the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So I love PGNO. You always need stimulating colleagues, and these people can give that to you.